Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Mindgasms podcast. We're going to continue our Pragmatism and Richard Rorty series and talk more about his book called Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity. And of course, we've got Chief Keefe, aka Tim Keefe, back for that. So, do you want to start off with a bit of an introduction, as you always do there, Tim?
I sure do. Okay, so we are continuing Richard Rorty. We are also continuing with what I take to be his magnum opus, Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, which is a collection of essays that came out sometime in the mid-'80s after he had made what one could call the pragmatic turn. So I'm not going to go too much into the backstory. I've already done so in the previous episodes, but we can go ahead and continue with the first part of the book here on contingency. Now, last time we went over a little bit what contingency, irony, and solidarity each mean. So contingency is in opposition to necessity. Necessity is it must happen. Contingency is it could happen, not by necessity. You talk about accidents. It's contingent that something would happen here, or in common parlance, for something to happen is contingent upon certain circumstances. So if they happen or they may happen, then the other thing will happen too. Okay, irony. So then irony is not Alanis Morissette type irony, but it is more in the vein of rhetorical irony or narrative irony, so some things like this. Basically is something of the opposite that is happening. And then solidarity, which is the shared goals, desires, and feelings, what have you, amongst certain groups, which is in contradistinction to tribalism in particular, and a national sense of pride. So it is possible for people of diverse backgrounds to have a sense of solidarity together. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and do a recap of the first essay we were covering, which is the contingency of language. Okay, so the highlights from that essay were that in Rorty's view is that all language is contingent. Okay, it's because only descriptions of the world can be true or false. And those descriptions are made by humans who must also make truth or falsity. And truth and falsity, therefore, is not determined by any intrinsic property of the world being described. Okay, so truth and falsity is not out there. It is something that humans create rather than discover. And they discover it they make it because it is a property of language, fundamentally. And language is something that is contingent because it is created by human beings. Okay? Right. It doesn't require a whole lot of thought to really get down and say, yeah, okay, I can go with that. Because language is not something that was created. We speak English. Some people speak French. Other people speak German. Other people spoke ancient languages that died out a long time ago, and our language itself, English, is a bastardized Anglo-Saxon tongue that has a lot of Greek and Roman roots to it, and some borrowings from other languages. So the English that we speak today is not the same language that people in England had spoke about 500 years ago. Okay, so what we're speaking now is contingent upon what came before it. Same thing for the other languages. Okay, but the key point here is that truth or falsity is something that is made. It is not out there in the world to be discovered. Okay, so to unpack this a little bit more, for example, a factual case of green grass is not true or false in and of itself, but that grass is green, a statement or a sentence, may be true. I can say that grass is green, and you could agree with the statement, which for Rorty makes the statement true. But our use of the words to describe grass is distinct and independent of the grass itself. Okay. Good so far?
Yep.
Okay. So then continuing on, that apart from human expression in language, notions of truth or falsity are simply irrelevant. or may be inexistent or nonsensical. And then Rorty consequently argues that all discussion of language in relation to reality should be abandoned, and then one should instead discuss vocabularies in relation to other vocabularies. In coherence with this view, he states in the essay that he will not exactly be making arguments in the book, because arguments, as expression mostly within the domain of a given vocabulary, preclude novelty. Okay, so what he's getting at here is that the vocabulary that one has and how one uses it creates novelty, new ways of describing things, or redescribing things that had hitherto previously have been described. Okay, so for example, slavery taken as a given in years past, justifications, arguments for why slavery is something that is natural. Okay, so the theoretical underpinning at the time was that this was the natural order, but over time, and particularly with the abolitionist movement in the 19th century, prior to the American Civil War, in the case of the United States, was redescribing things where slavery is not a given. Slavery was, for all intents and purposes, a contingent phenomena. It just happened to arise, not particularly for North America, but also in Europe too, and amongst the Arabs and other peoples. Slavery was a fact of human life for many centuries prior to the Civil War. So all it took really over time was just a redescription that slavery was not a given, it was not okay, and that those that were enslaved, particularly Africans, in the case of North American slavery, had certain rights, and they were not described as subhuman, they were described as just human. Okay, so the point here is that that vocabulary shifted to a different vocabulary in the use of it to produce novelty, new ways of looking at things. But they weren't so concerned about, or at least Rorty is getting at, definitely not really talking about truth or falsity. Okay, it's irrelevant in the end. Make sense so far?
Yeah, I like that.
Okay. So that's what Rorty has to say about language. Now, for today, I hope to cover the next two essays, which are the contingency of selfhood and the contingency of a liberal community. Okay, this is still in the first section. We're talking about contingency. Okay, with that out of the way, let's go ahead to the second essay, the contingency of selfhood, which begins on page 23. Now, I'm going to go ahead and skip through a lot of the prefatory material here because he is discussing a poem by Philip Larkin, which we don't really need to get into. But if we move down to page 27, I will pick up his line here. So in the previous paragraph, he talked about Nietzsche. Okay, so Rorty says, quote, "It was Nietzsche who first explicitly suggested that we drop the whole idea of, quote, knowing the truth. His definition of truth as a, quote, mobile army of metaphors amounted to saying that the whole idea of representing reality by means of language, and thus the idea of finding a single context for all human lives, should be abandoned. His perspectivism, we've covered this in other podcasts before, Nietzsche was not a relativist, he was a perspectivalist. His perspectivism amounted to the claim that the universe had no lading list to be known, no determinate length. He hoped that once we realized that Plato's true world was just a fable, we would see consolation at the moment of death, not in having transcended the animal condition, but in being that peculiar sort of dying animal who, by describing himself in his own terms, had created himself. More exactly, he would have created the only part of himself that mattered by constructing his own mind. To create one's mind is to create one's own language, rather than to let the length of one's mind be set by the language other human beings have left behind. So Rorty in here is intimating that the concept of mind is something that arises from, in a large degree, the use of one's language and the way one describes oneself, particularly the contents of one's own mind. Okay.
So is he saying that the mind doesn't exist then, or that it does exist?
It's unclear at this point.
Okay.
Now,
Oh, you get cut off there. Your audio just got cut off for about 5 or 10 seconds there.
okay. Am I good?
Yeah.
Okay. So he came from a tradition of what you could call social justice, but not today's idiots. Rather, something that
Not
was
the
more
fringe wackaloons.
not the fringe wackos, no. Something more of a kind of a Marxist or slightly communistic. He was born in the 30s, so this is pre-World War II, when these kind of things were still being talked about. And so he was very much concerned about the social rather than Platonic, otherworldly type things. Okay, pretty much a large part of the history of philosophy. Again, going back to Whitehead's quote that all of Western philosophy is but a footnote to Plato. When he completed his PhD and he began his academic career, particularly when he went to Princeton, he started to get more involved with the then leading analytic philosophy, which started to talk more about language and language games, not quite the later Wittgenstein, but positivism, and then also philosophy of mind. So some of his earlier essays, he is talking about things like the incorrigibility of mind, that one cannot be mistaken about the contents of one's mind. But as he had his pragmatic turn as he going through the late 60s into the early 70s, then he started to question some of these concepts with the mind. So what he's getting at here, referencing Nietzsche, is that there's not that fixed essence to the person. There is the fact that human beings are finite animals. We come into the world. The languages that we use, that we learn to use, is contingent. Where we are born and the type of culture or context we are born into is contingent. How we describe ourselves, we do it through the use of vocabularies to produce novelties. And this kind of mind or even self that we come to have is also contingent. Why? It's because we use language to describe what we are to ourselves and to others.
Okay.
Okay. So I think I have references elsewhere. So if we're talking about the 10-year-old Andrew Meinzer, what he used to describe himself at that age is different than the 30-year-old Andrew and how he describes himself now. You don't have a fixed essence.
Right.
Okay.
So
as your vocabulary grew, as you got older, and you read more and more, and that you conversed with other people by understanding what their vocabularies are and taking some of that as your own, you now have a different sense of self that is contingent upon language and how you understand yourself at this point in time in your life.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, totally.
All right.
Also, what's the difference between perspectivism and relativism?
Okay. So broadly defined, relativism is your view is as good as mine. Okay. My world is as good as your world, how I describe it. Perspectivism is each one of us has a certain perspective on the world or something that is out there. Okay. But it's not, if I believe in pink elephants, that's just as good as you not believing in pink elephants. Okay, pink elephants exist or they don't. We could agree on that, or maybe not. But each one of us has a certain perspective of the world in which we live. Even though in the previous essay with the contingency of language, the concept of a world itself is under question. Because what do human beings mean when they talk about the world and how they describe the world?
Right.
Okay.
So with Nietzsche's perspectivism, then I don't remember. Does he say whether there being different perspectives means that they're kind of like all equally relevant, or that some are more superior to others?
I would say it's the latter. Just because you have a certain perspective on the world doesn't mean that it is the best perspective on the world.
Okay.
Okay. You have a perspective regardless, as do I. Our perspectives might overlap. I don't think we can have a 100% line up of each one of our perspectives because, again, contingency comes into the picture that my experiences are different from your experiences and my vocabulary might be different than yours. Okay.
Right.
All right.
Okay.
But the point here is, as he was touching upon in the first essay, is that it is not about essentialism. That with language, there is no essential component to language. It is contingent. Now, what he's getting at in this essay is there is no essential self. There is a contingent self.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
So continuing in the next paragraph, he says, but in abandoning the traditional notion of truth, Nietzsche did not abandon the idea of discovering the causes of our being what we are. He did not give up the idea that an individual might track home the blind impress all his behavings bore. He only rejected the idea that this tracking was a process of discovery. In his view, in achieving this sort of self-knowledge, we are not coming to know a truth which was out there or in here all the time. Rather, he saw self-knowledge as self-creation. The process of coming to know oneself, confronting one's contingency, tracking one's causes home, is identical with the process of inventing a new language. That is, of thinking up some new metaphors for any literal description of one's individuality, which is to say, any use of an inherited language game for this purpose, will necessarily fail. One will not have traced that idiosyncrasy home, but will merely have managed to see it as not idiosyncratic after all, as a specimen reiterating a type, a copy or replica of something which has already been identified. To fail as a poet,
You still there, Tim? I think your audio cut out again.
Oh, sorry. To fail as a poet, and thus for Nietzsche, to fail as a human being, is to accept somebody else's description of oneself, to execute a previously prepared program, to write, at most, elegant variations on previously written poems. So the only way to trace home the causes of one's being as one is, would be to tell a story about one's causes in a new language. Okay? So let's go back up to the first part of the paragraph. He, meaning Nietzsche, only rejected the idea that this tracking was a process of discovery. In his view, in achieving this sort of self-knowledge, we are not coming to know a truth which was out there or in here all the time. Rather, he saw self-knowledge as self-creation. Okay. So the criticism here is in coming to know oneself. All right. Is there something deep down within you that as you mature and you become an adult, you go back to discover what was already there? No, that's not what he's getting at. Whatever you do, this self-knowledge or this self-discovery is a self-creation, because as you're going inward, metaphorically speaking, you're describing yourself contingently with a contingent language. Okay? And when you come to understand, too, what your origins were, okay, because when you're 3, 4 years old, you're not really cognizant of the whole contingency thing, that you're speaking the English language. You're just speaking a language that your parents and everybody else around you are speaking. You come to understand what it is as English. You come to understand what the vocabulary is. Then again, I made this point earlier, that you're taking this language, this vocabulary, and describing yourself as you grow up and as you mature. Refining, first creating and then refining what your sense of self is. I is Andrew, or I is Tim, or your mother, or your father, or your next door neighbor, who it is. Okay? Making sense so far?
Yeah, for sure.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Skipping to the bottom of page 28. Oh, just one thing. So, as a side note, I think Rorty might mention this sort of later on, or definitely it's in a footnote. He's also making reference to Harold Bloom, the late literary critic, professor at Yale University, who's written a lot of books over the years about Shakespeare, the Western canon, and so on and so forth. So one of his earlier books from around 1973 is titled The Anxiety of Influence, where he talks about poets, and particularly the strong poet as distinct from the weak poet. So this reference here that Rorty makes about to fail as a poet is to accept somebody else's description of oneself. So this is something that the poet, in Bloom's view, is always working against, because the poet is supposed to be, you could also put in another artist there, quite possibly, a sculptor, a painter, even a musician, or whatever it is, to try to be original, okay, to come up with something new, or close to new as possible. But where the poet, or whoever the creative person is, fails is when they realize that they are operating within somebody else's framework all along. Okay, so you as a poet, let's say you were a poet, you were trying to write sonnets. Okay, well, you were trying to write sonnets. Okay, a sonnet is a particular form. So it's unlikely that you would come up with a sonnet that's completely original. Why? Because you probably were influenced by Shakespeare, number one. You probably were influenced by Robert Browning, who also wrote sonnets, and a handful of other poets who were writing sonnets too. Now, it's not to say you could not come up with something that is original, but is it highly original where you detach yourself and you're leaving behind what your previous influences were? That's what the strong poet, in Bloom's estimation, accomplishes.
I'm not sure that's even possible.
Okay,
like,
go on.
I kind of think that there are old ideas that are expressed in new ways. Like you can go back to archetypes, sort of like Joseph Campbell talks about, for example, but just get expressed in new ways. Like I know that there are definitely ideas in lots of novels I read, for example, that seem totally new. Like I don't know, I can't compare them to anything else really. But then I usually hear about other people who do compare them to something they know. So, like, for example, in terms of poetry, the only one of my poems that actually did win a local poetry contest was a very well-known archetype about two people in love, and it's about how love fades over time, and that's obviously a theme that has been done many countless times over years.
Right.
And like people like the old archetypes, like Lord of the Rings, for example. There's another fantasy series called Wheel of Time that Dusty got me into, that is like, it's kind of like Lord of the Rings archetypes, but evolved and made like 10 times more complex and intricate. But it's still awesome because it reminds people of those old ideas, but then it also creates so much more level of detail and expresses them in different ways, and has characters doing things that are never explored in other realms. And like that's basically what I've thought about a lot before in terms of this subject.
Oh, sure. And that's not to say that anybody who does creative work doesn't come up with something that's fresh. Okay. Quite unique, that's a different story. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, shifting gears for a minute, because I'm a big classical music fan. So instead of the poets, let's insert a musician. Okay. So with each particular period, from Renaissance going into the Baroque, going into the classical, going to the Romantic, the 19th century, and then 20th century, whatever you would study in music appreciation, main figures, Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, Schumann, whoever it is. They stand out because I would say they fit the strong poet role that Bloom highlights. Why? Because they were products of their time. They were influenced by who came before them, but they were able to create something that was truly original and truly unique, depending on how much you want to define that set them apart from what their influence was. For example, Mozart, though he only lived to be 35 years old, started composing when he was a young kid. And his early compositions were borrowings from other composers at the time that influenced him. Okay? So, yes, scholars have pointed this out. This clearly shows an influence of J.C. Bach or whoever it was that he studied. But then there was a turn when he started to produce something that was original. Okay? So, as a strong poet, strong musician, he was able to create something that was quite unique at the time and free himself from his previous influences. Okay, that's what makes the strong poet in Bloom's estimation. But then going back to my other point about you is, yeah, if you're creative, you can make something that, like with your Lord of the Rings example. Yeah, okay, so that has more detail than the Lord of the Rings. But how many people are going to look at this and say, well, this reminds me of the Lord of the Rings, and this character reminds me of Bilbo, this character reminds me of the Nazgul, whoever it is, okay? So there's always going to be that comparison. Yeah. And then it is up to the person, the author, the poet, the musician, or whoever it is. They are the ones that are struggling with the fact of, well, I was hoping to create something that was really unique, and I don't want to become another Tolkien, okay? That's what they're struggling against, to become the strong poet or the strong creative person in a wider definition.
But at the same time, too, what I think is interesting is that people also sometimes don't like it if you don't stick to the original archetypes enough. Like a good example that I can think of is the newest Star Wars trilogy, how a lot of people don't like the second and third movies because they try to escape the original Star Wars Joseph Campbell archetypes too much.
Well, they're retreads of the original trilogy.
Yeah,
as many have pointed out.
First one, but like the second and third one, although I actually haven't seen the third one, so no spoilers, but the second one in particular, like, breaks, or at least tries to break out of the archetypes. But the first one is like a remake of A New Hope, basically.
Yeah, it's a complete retread. I remember when I sat through it, I'm just like, really?
Yeah, it's like,
really?
A New Hope, version 2 with a woman instead now.
Yeah. Oh, a female Luke Skywalker. How original.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you bring up a salient point too, is that there's going to be a lot of people who don't like whatever the creative person comes up with. But again, going back to the other point, is that was the case with a poet or a novelist or a musician, whoever it is. When they created their original works at the time, lots of people didn't like it. It was only later on where they could look back to the person and say, well, what he, or maybe even she, did was truly original, but was not appreciated at the time.
Yeah, like you mentioned Mozart, and he's a good example of that.
Yes.
And Shakespeare too, I think, right?
Who?
Shakespeare?
Shakespeare? Well, Shakespeare was
popular when he was living.
Yeah, they were popular. A better example than Mozart for musicians was Johann Sebastian Bach.
Right.
When he died in 1750, his music was more or less forgotten for about 100 years, until Mendelssohn, who was somewhat of an original composer in his own right, resurrected his music, Bach's music, and began to play it on a larger scale. Then there was this rediscovery of a sort of Bach's music, and now since then he is held up as a paragon of the Baroque period. But at the time, even before he died in 1750, his music was already considered old-fashioned.
Interesting.
He really wasn't appreciated as much as he is now in his own day. Okay, but let's go ahead and put a pin in that. I just wanted to take a sideline to Bloom, what he's getting at with the strong, or what the poet is trying to do in breaking free, working to break free of the contingency that he or she is faced with. Okay? Even philosophers could be like this, as Rorty says in the previous paragraph, which I'm not going to read, because philosophers, even philosophers too, coming up with something original. Going back to the Whitehead quote, all of philosophy is but a footnote to Plato. Aristotle was starting to break away from Plato, but as some scholars will point out, is that Aristotle never really fully broke away from Plato. Instead, took the forms from the other worldly realm and put it in the here and now, the physical world.
Yeah.
Okay, but let's not get into that. All right, continuing, page 28, bottom paragraph, Rorty says, only poets, Nietzsche suspected, can truly appreciate contingency. The rest of us are doomed to remain philosophers, to insist that there is really only one true lading list, one true description of the human situation, one universal context of our lives. We are doomed to spend our conscious lives trying to escape from contingency, rather than, like the strong poet, acknowledging and appropriating contingency. For Nietzsche, therefore, the line between the strong poet and the rest of the human race has the moral significance which Plato and Christianity attached to the distinction between the human and the animal. For although strong poets are, like all other animals, causal products of natural forces, they are products capable of telling the story of their own production in words never used before. The line between weakness and strength is thus the line between using language which is familiar and universal, and producing language which, though initially unfamiliar and idiosyncratic, somehow makes tangible the blind impress all one's behavings bear. Note those two words, unfamiliar and idiosyncratic. With luck, the sort of luck which makes the difference between genius and eccentricity, that language will also strike the next generation as inevitable. Their behavings will bear that impress. Okay? So going back to what I was saying before about the creative person, at the time it is initially unfamiliar and idiosyncratic. Okay? Then later on, people look back and they say, oh, sure, of course.
Yeah, that's kind of what we were talking about earlier a little bit.
Yeah. Not appreciated at the time because it is unfamiliar.
Yeah.
Okay. Next paragraph, Rorty says, to put the same point in another way, the Western philosophical tradition thinks of a human life as a triumph, just insofar as it breaks out of the world of time, appearance, and idiosyncratic opinion into another world, into the world of enduring truth. Nietzsche, by contrast, thinks the important boundary to cross is not the one separating time from atemporal truth, but rather the one which divides the old from the new. He thinks a human life triumphant, just insofar as it escapes from inherited descriptions of the contingencies of its existence and finds new descriptions. This is the difference between the will to truth and the will to self-overcoming, which, by the way, is the will to power. It is the difference between thinking of redemption as making contact with something larger and more enduring than oneself, and redemption, as Nietzsche describes it, quote, recreating all it was into a thus I willed it. Okay. Next, he says, the drama of an individual human life, or of the history of humanity as a whole, is not one in which a pre-existent goal is triumphantly reached or tragically not reached. Neither a constant external reality nor an unfailing interior source of inspiration forms a background for such dramas. Instead, to see one's life, or the life of one's community, as a dramatic narrative is to see it as a process of Nietzschean self-overcoming. The paradigm of such a narrative is the life of the genius, who can say of the relevant portion of the past, thus I willed it, because she has found a way to describe that past which the past never knew, and thereby found a self to be which her precursors never knew was possible.
I like that. It's interesting.
Yeah. By the way, Rorty doesn't mention this, but this is the distinction in Nietzsche between the Apollonian and the Dionysian.
Oh, right. That was one of his earlier books, right?
Right. The Birth of Tragedy. So the
Right.
Apollonian is concerned with rationality, with philosophy, the external reality, and the essential unchanging, the enduring. Whereas the Dionysian is the one that is more preoccupied with the contingent, because what is Dionysius? Bacchus. Okay. The god of wine, dance, having fun, blah,
That
blah,
one
blah.
sounds better to me.
So, yeah, sounds better to you. And then the self-overcoming, the will to power, which this is, I think, the better definition of what the will to power is. Thus I willed it. Self-overcoming, becoming the Ubermensch, not
Right.
imposing strength upon the world to control it necessarily.
Maybe you could explain the Ubermensch a little bit. Like that means the Superman, right? Like the idealized self, or
sometimes it's translated as the Superman. I don't like that. In fact, I prefer the Overman, because
the Overman, right.
Uber means over. So the the intimation in the Overman is you are overcoming what man is. You're not becoming a Superman more than a man. You're just trying to get past whatever man is.
Right. Yeah, I remember from reading Thus Spoke Zarathustra that it kind of sounds like just having the goal of enlightenment, basically.
Whatever enlightenment is.
Yeah.
Okay, so going to the next paragraph, where he says, in this Nietzschean view, the impulse to think, to inquire, or reweave oneself ever more thoroughly is not wonder but terror. It is once again Bloom, this is Harold Bloom, quote, horror of finding oneself to be only a copy or replica. That's the poet's fear. The wonder in which Aristotle believed philosophy to begin was wonder at finding oneself in a world larger, stronger, nobler than oneself. The fear in which Bloom's poets begin is the fear that one might end one's days in such a world one never made, an inherited world. The hope of such a poet is that what the past tried to do to her, she will succeed in doing to the past, to make the past itself, including those very causal processes which blindly impressed all her own behavings, bear her impress. Success in that enterprise, the enterprise of saying, thus I willed it, to the past, is success in what Bloom calls giving birth to oneself.
Interesting.
Okay, so that's the fear. And philosophers, in Rorty's estimation, are the ones that are stuck in describing the world as it is, or trying to describe the world as it is, getting to the essence of what it is, rather than trying to, and same thing with what the self is, what the person is, definitional, blah, 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 rather than pointing to one's contingency, pointing to the past and saying, thus I willed it. I have escaped from what has come before. I have created myself in a way where the past and my past has been redone according to how I see it.
Right.
Giving birth to oneself. Okay. It's a tall order.
Yeah, sure is.
And I would say a very small percentage of people are able to do that. And this is what the genius is.
Oh yeah. That's why to compare it to Enlightenment again, like it's good to have that goal and acknowledge that it's like basically impossible to achieve. Like I'm reminded right now of Robert Wright, who I think we talked about before. I'm a big fan of his podcast, and I've read a few of his books.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about how he's really into Buddhism and meditation, and how few people even proclaim to be enlightened. And he would say that it's almost impossible, but maybe half a dozen people or so have achieved it.
And even if the person was enlightened, how would they describe it to you?
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I don't know. It'd probably be in different ways, I would guess.
Oh, sure. I remember when I was getting into Zen a little bit many years ago. And sure, there's all different ways that you can describe what enlightenment is. A Zen priest could tell you, well, enlightenment is like fill in the blank. Okay. All of these are just descriptions of what it is.
Yeah.
But do descriptions get at what it is? If you're enlightened, you're probably not going to go crowing about it.
Yeah, probably, because that would be like giving into your ego.
Right. Right. I guess you kind of know if you're enlightened or not. And I would also say is that if you really get into the study of Buddhism, lots of different ways to do it, apart from Robert Wright. He's only one of a long lineage of people who were describing about Buddhism. You go back in the scholarly literature from decades ago, in whatever the descriptions from what they take from the religious texts about the description of what enlightenment is. You can read many different descriptions of enlightenment and kind of get an idea of what it might be, but it's not a, shall we say, visceral experience as you would if you had that experience.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. Remember the Buddhist who went to the hot dog seller in New York City and said, "Make me one with everything." All right. So skipping through the essay, he leaves Nietzsche behind and then he goes into Freud. Okay. So I'm not going to get to the huge description of Freud, but I will read a couple passages here. All right. On page 32. Rorty continues. He says, one can sum up this point in the preceding paragraph. Let's see. Yeah, we'll skip that. One can sum up this point by saying that Freud makes moral deliberation just as finely grained, just as detailed and as multiform as prudential calculation has always been. He thereby helps break down the distinction between moral guilt and practical inadvisability, thereby blurring the prudence-morality distinction. So he's talking about morality here. By contrast, Plato's and Kant's moral philosophies center around this distinction, as does moral philosophy, in the sense in which it is typically understood by contemporary analytic philosophers. Kant splits us into two parts, one called reason, which is identical in us all, and another, empirical sensation and desire, which is a matter of blind, contingent, idiosyncratic impressions. In contrast, Freud treats rationality as a mechanism, which adjusts contingencies to other contingencies. But his mechanization of reason is not just one more abstract philosophical reductionism, not just one more inverted Platonism. Rather than discuss rationality in the abstract, simplistic, and reductionist way in which Hobbes and Hume discuss it, a way which retains Plato's original dualisms for the sake of inverting them, Freud spends his time exhibiting the extraordinary sophistication, subtlety, and wit of our unconscious strategies. He thereby makes it possible for us to see science and poetry, genius and psychosis, and most importantly, morality and prudence, not as products of distinct faculties, but as alternative modes of adaptation. Next paragraph.
Well written.
Freud thus helps us take seriously the possibility that there is no central faculty, no central self, called reason, and thus to take Nietzschean pragmatism and perspectivalism seriously. Freudian moral psychology gives us a vocabulary for self-description, which is radically different from Plato's, and also radically different from that side of Nietzsche, which Heidegger rightly condemned as one more example of inverted Platonism. The romantic attempt to exalt the flesh over the spirit, the heart over the head, the mythical faculty called will over an equally mythical one called reason. Okay. And by the way, Heidegger, in his lectures on Nietzsche, had called Nietzsche the last great metaphysician.
Right.
Because of the will to power.
Right.
As a metaphysical principle, in spite of itself.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay. So, reiterating the point.
What do you think about that? Like, do you think that he also Yeah, I guess we did talk about that. You do think that he, like Nietzsche, did not manage to escape metaphysics, right?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what I had said before about I really think it's very difficult, if not impossible, to a certain extent, to escape metaphysics.
Right.
Okay, and there are many different ways that you could describe metaphysics. Okay, is it the classic definition of metaphysics is Platonist or even Kantian? You know, that's one way. Is it metaphysics that is maybe an emergent phenomena in the use of language? Yeah, I would put my money behind that one better. And but the thing that I like about Rorty is that he shifts the focus from definitely from truth, in the contingency of language, definitely from truth and falsity rather to vocabularies. And it's about descriptions and redescriptions. And I think in some respects he is intimating, though he doesn't explicitly call it out, is that these sorts of things, these concepts that philosophers have been preoccupied with or wrangling over for centuries are just things that kind of emerge, and this is the Wittgensteinian um, influence here. They arise from the use of language. When we talk that people are possessed of reason, well, what does reason mean? Many different ways that you can define that and describe how reason is used. And you're using language to do it inescapably. Okay?
Right.
But, and then Rorty's point here about Freud is that Freud, as he says in the first sentence, Freud thus helps take us seriously the possibility that there is no central faculty, no central self called reason. Okay? When you take away reason, then you are not so preoccupied with rules, strategies, categories, and so on. And then he says, and thus take Nietzschean pragmatism and perspectivalism seriously. Because if you put all of your money and your emphasis behind that everybody is possessed of reason and they can use their reason properly, then perspectivalism falls short. Because there is only one way to reason. There is only one way to see things.
Right.
Okay. If you do that, then you can't take pragmatism or perspectivalism seriously. And in the next essay on the liberal democracy, Rorty is trying to answer charges against relativism and rationalism because, in part, there's that confusion between relativism and perspectivalism, also with pragmatism, which he mentioned before in the one essay from Consequences of Pragmatism. You're a pragmatist, and so nobody will take pragmatism seriously because they think it boils down to relativism.
Right.
Which it doesn't in Rorty's estimation.
Right.
Okay. All right, skipping the next paragraph, bottom of page 33. We're still on morality here in Freud. So Rorty says, another way of putting this point is that Freud gave up Plato's attempt to bring together the public and the private, the parts of the state and the parts of the soul, the search for social justice and the search for individual perfection. Freud gave equal respect to the appeals of moralism and romanticism, but refused either to grant one of these priority over the other or to attempt the synthesis of them. He distinguished sharply between a private ethic of self-creation and a public ethic of mutual accommodation. He persuades us that there is no bridge between them provided by universally shared beliefs or desires. Beliefs or desires which belong to us qua human, and which unite us to our fellow humans simply as human. Next, in Freud's account, our conscious private goals are as idiosyncratic as the unconscious obsessions and phobias from which they have branched off. Despite the efforts of such writers as Erich Fromm and Herbert Marcuse, Freudian moral psychology cannot be used to define social goals for humanity as opposed to goals for individuals. There is no way to force Freud into a Platonic mold by treating him as a moral philosopher who supplies universal criteria for goodness or rightness or true happiness. His only utility lies in his ability to turn us away from the universal to the concrete, from the attempt to find necessary truths in eliminable beliefs to the idiosyncratic contingencies of our individual pasts, to the blind impress all our behavings bear. He has provided us with a moral psychology which is compatible with Nietzsche's and Bloom's attempt to see the strong poet as the archetypical human being. And this is in contradistinction to Plato and Kant.
Right.
Okay.
Doesn't Nietzsche share that view?
What?
The poet being the supreme type of human being?
Yeah, that's where Rorty mentioned above.
Right. Right.
Right. Self-creation.
Right.
Okay. All right. So then let's go to page 37 at the bottom. Rorty says, to sum up, poetic, artistic, philosophical, scientific, or political progress results from the accidental coincidence of a private obsession with a public need. Let me read this again. To sum up, poetic, artistic, philosophical, scientific, or political progress results from the accidental coincidence of a private obsession with a public need. Strong poetry, common sense morality, revolutionary morality, normal science, revolutionary science, and the sort of fantasy which is intelligible to only one person are all, from a Freudian point of view, different ways of dealing with blind impresses, or more precisely, ways of dealing with different blind impresses which may be unique to an individual or common to the members of some historically conditioned community. None of these strategies is privileged over others in the sense of expressing human nature better. No such strategy is more or less human than any other, any more than the pen is more truly a tool than the butcher's knife, or the hybridized orchid less a flower than the wild rose.
Okay.
Okay. So, let's see. Okay, then going to page 40, Rorty says, the world can blindly and inarticulately crush us. Mute despair, intense mental pain can cause us to blot ourselves out. But that sort of power is not the sort we can appropriate by adopting and then transforming its language, thereby becoming identical with the threatening power and subsuming it under our own more powerful selves. This latter strategy is appropriate only for coping with other persons, for example, with parents, gods, and poetic precursors. For our relation to the world, to brute power and to naked pain, is not the sort of relation we have to persons. Faced with the non-human, the non-linguistic, we no longer have an ability to overcome contingency and pain by appropriation and transformation, but only the ability to recognize contingency and pain. The final victory of poetry in its ancient quarrel with philosophy, the final victory of metaphors of self-creation over metaphors of discovery, would consist in our becoming reconciled to the thought that this is the only sort of power over the world which we can hope to have. For that would be the final abjuration of the notion that truth, and not just power in pain, is to be found out there. Okay?
Nice.
Okay. Okay, so let's go to page 42. So he says in the last paragraph, to sum up, I suggest that the best way to understand the pathos of finitude which Larkin, this is the poet that he mentions at the beginning of the essay, invokes, is to interpret it not as the failure to achieve what philosophy hoped to achieve, something non-idiosyncratic, atemporal, and universal, but as the realization that at a certain point, one has to trust to the goodwill of those who will live other lives and write other poems. Okay, so rather than because of the problem, well, I wouldn't say it's the problem, but as the discomforting fact of one's finitude as the human being, our finitude, is rather than escape into philosophy, to find something non-idiosyncratic, atemporal, and universal. You trust that those who come after us, they will live other lives and write other poems, as he says.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense.
All right. And then to the last page, page 43, last paragraph. He concludes saying, but if we avoid Nietzsche's inverted Platonism, his suggestion that a life of self-creation can be as complete and as autonomous as Plato thought a life of contemplation might be, then we shall be content to think of any human life as the always incomplete, yet sometimes heroic, reweaving of such a web. We shall see the conscious need of the strong poet to demonstrate that he is not a copy or replica as merely a special form of an unconscious need everyone has. The need to come to terms with the blind impress which chance has given him, to make a self for himself by redescribing the impress in terms which are, if only marginally, his own.
Okay.
All right. And that concludes that essay. So, questions, comments?
No, I like that. It's like it follows his theme about how things are contingent, particularly in this first part, right? How the self is contingent, and I like his connections to Nietzsche and Freud. That's very interesting.
Right. Also, something else you can pull from this is that actually, in many respects, it is better to be the poet than it is the philosopher, because the philosopher is too concerned with something that is unchanging, getting at the essence. But if you do that, or if you see human beings as something that is static and unchanging, where's the novelty?
Right.
Where's the creativity?
Right.
Okay. But at the same time, that comes at a cost, because with that, you realize about finitude, about contingency, about the strong influences that are a part of you and that you might not be fully aware of and that you're working against to try to create oneself as an individual.
Right.
Okay. And then trusting that people that come after you in future generations will do the same.
Right.
Okay. So that concludes that essay. How are we doing on time here? We are
8 o'clock my time and 10 your time.
Okay, let's go ahead and get to the next essay, The Contingency of a Liberal Community, and then we can finish up with that. Okay, so we've seen language and we've seen selfhood. Now let's look at community, and note the title, The Liberal Community, okay? Because Rorty was a liberal, but in the old sense of the liberal. Okay. So this is chapter 3, starting on page 44. Now, in this essay, okay, he begins in the first paragraph. He says, anyone who says, as I did in chapter 1, this is about the contingency of language, that truth is not out there, will be suspected of relativism and irrationalism. Anyone who casts doubt on the distinction between morality and prudence, as I did in chapter 2, which is about selfhood, will be suspected of immorality. To fend off such suspicions, I need to argue that the distinctions between absolutism and relativism, between rationality and irrationality, and between morality and expediency are obsolete and clumsy tools, remnants of a vocabulary we should try to replace. But argument is not the right word. For on my account of intellectual progress as the literalization of selected metaphors, rebutting objections to one's redescriptions of some things will be largely a matter of redescribing other things, trying to outflank the objections by enlarging the scope of one's favorite metaphors. So my strategy will be to try to make the vocabulary in which these objections are phrased look bad, thereby changing the subject, rather than granting the objector his choice of weapons and terrain by meeting his criticisms head on. Okay. So he's doing a runaround. He continues, in this chapter I shall claim that the institutions and culture of liberal society would be better served by a vocabulary of moral and political reflection, which avoids the distinctions I have listed than by a vocabulary which preserves them. I shall try to show that the vocabulary of Enlightenment rationalism, although it was essential to the beginnings of liberal democracy, has become an impediment to the preservation and progress of democratic societies. I shall claim that the vocabulary I adumbrated in the first two chapters, one which revolves around notions of metaphor and self-creation, rather than around notions of truth, rationality, and moral obligation, is better suited for this purpose. Okay? So the Enlightenment rationalism was essential for the birth of liberal democracy, but now it has become an obstacle. And he was writing this in the mid to late 80s.
Right. Yeah, I can see why some people call him a postmodernist for that.
Right. And postmodernism, as we covered many different times, is a hot button term anymore. Many different ways that you can define it.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's go to the next page. Page 45. Okay. Rorty says, the difference between a search for foundations and an attempt at redescription is emblematic of the difference between the culture of liberalism and older forms of cultural life. Okay, note the first sentence. The search for foundations, which is what a philosopher/metaphysician would be doing, and an attempt at redescription, which he also defined in the introduction as what a liberal ironist is up to. The distinction between cultural liberalism and older forms of cultural life continues. For in its ideal form, the culture of liberalism would be one which was enlightened, secular through and through. It would be one in which no trace of divinity remained, either in the form of a divinized world or a divinized self. Such a culture would have no room for the notion that there are non-human forces to which human beings should be responsible. It would drop or drastically reinterpret not only the idea of holiness, but those of, quote, devotion to truth and of, quote, fulfillment of the deepest needs of the spirit. The process of de-divinization, which I described in the previous two chapters, would ideally culminate in our no longer being able to see any use for the notion that finite, mortal, contingently existing human beings might derive their meanings of their lives from anything except other finite, mortal, contingently existing human beings. Let me read this again. The process of de-divinization, which I described in the previous two chapters, would ideally culminate in our no longer being able to see any use for the notion that finite, mortal, contingently existing human beings might derive the meanings of their lives from anything other except finite, mortal, contingently existing human beings. In such a culture, warnings of relativism, queries whether social institutions had become increasingly rational in modern times, and doubts about whether the aims of liberal society were objective moral values would seem merely quaint. Okay? So, he's moving away from these kind of foundations and overarching principles at work. Rather, it is we as finite human beings derive understandings, descriptions, what have you, from other finite human beings, not for something that is otherworldly, which is what it was broadly defined before the Enlightenment, the birth of liberal society.
Right.
Okay. So let's go ahead, skip through some of this to page 48, bottom paragraph. So Rorty says, to accept the claim that there is no standpoint outside the particular historically conditioned and temporary vocabulary we are presently using, from which to judge this vocabulary, is to give up on the idea that there can be reasons for using languages as well as reasons within languages for believing statements. And statements are what are true or false. This amounts to giving up the idea that intellectual or political progress is rational, in any sense of, quote, rational, which is neutral between vocabularies. But because it seems pointless to say that all the great moral and intellectual advances of European history, Christianity, Galilean science, the Enlightenment, rationalism, and so on, where fortunate falls into temporary irrationality. The moral to be drawn is that the rational-irrational distinction is less useful than it once appeared. Once we realize that progress, for the community as for the individual, is a matter of using new words as well as of arguing from premises phrased in old words, we realize that a critical vocabulary which revolves around notions like rational, criteria, argument, and foundation and absolute is badly suited to describe the relation between the old and the new. Okay. Definition of progress, using new words as well as of arguing from premises phrased in old words. Okay. So also what's intimated here is some of these terms like rational, criteria, argument, and so on are not ahistorical.
Right, of course. They're contingent upon their history.
Yes. Historicizing is the term used here. All right. So then skipping to page 51. Rorty continues. Is there a way to resolve this standoff between the traditional view that it is always in point to ask, how do you know? And the view that sometimes all we can ask is, why do you talk that way? Philosophy as a discipline makes itself ridiculous when it steps forward at such junctures and says that it will find neutral ground on which to adjudicate the issue. It is not as if the philosophers had succeeded in finding some neutral ground on which to stand. It would be better for philosophers to admit that there is no one way to break such standoffs, no single place to which it is appropriate to step back. There are instead as many ways of breaking the standoff as there are topics of conversation. One can come at the issue by way of different paradigms of humanity. The contemplator as opposed to the poet, or the pious person as opposed to the person who accepts chance as worthy of determining her fate. Or one could come at it from the point of view of an ethics of kindness and ask whether cruelty and injustice will be diminished if we are stopped worrying about, quote, absolute validity, or whether, on the contrary, only such worries keep our characters firm enough to defend unflinchingly the weak against the strong. Or one can, fruitlessly in my view, come at it by way of anthropology and the question of whether there are, quote, cultural universals, or by way of psychology and the question of whether there are psychological universals. Because of this indefinite plurality of standpoints, this vast number of ways of coming at the issue sideways and trying to outflank one's opponents, there are never in practice any standoffs. Okay?
Okay.
And then in the next paragraph he says, we would only have a real and practical standoff, as opposed to an artificial and theoretical one, if certain topics and certain language games were taboo, if there were general agreement within the society that certain questions were always in point, that certain questions were prior to certain others, that there was a fixed order of discussion, and that flanking movements were not permitted. That would be the sort of society which liberals are trying to avoid, one in which logic ruled and rhetoric was outlawed. It is central to the idea of a liberal society that, in respect to words as opposed to deeds, persuasion as opposed to force, anything goes. This open-mindedness should not be fostered because, as Scripture teaches, truth, capital T, is great and will prevail, nor because, as John Milton suggests, truth will always win in a free and open encounter. It should be fostered for its own sake. A liberal society is one which is content to call true whatever the upshot of such encounters turns out to be. Let me read this again. A liberal society is one which is content to call true whatever the upshot of such encounters turns out to be. That is why a liberal society is badly served by an attempt to supply it with philosophical foundations. For the attempt to supply such foundations presupposes a natural order of topics and arguments, which is prior to, and overrides the results of, encounters between old and new vocabularies. Okay? Is all this making sense so far?
Yeah.
Okay. So
outlawing rhetoric seems kind of extreme.
Yeah, well, again, to reiterate the point here is that what the liberals, and we could even say like a classical liberal, that's kind of really what it's getting at. What the classical liberal from the Enlightenment was trying to do is to move away from taboos about language and describing things, because that, and we're taking a broad definition here, that's what it was like in the previous centuries. You just didn't talk about certain things, or there was a certain ways of describing the world that were accepted, and other ways were not.
Right.
Okay. So the purpose of a liberal society is whatever is true, and this is in Rorty's definition, whatever is true is discussions, arguments, disagreements, whatever it happens to be, whatever is the outcome of this will be true. Rather than there are ahistorical, fundamental, logical groundings of how things work. And that is the standard this is the standard which is applied to whatever discussions are about such things.
Right.
Okay. All right. So then continuing the next paragraph, the last point permits me to turn to the larger claim I put forward earlier. The claim that liberal culture needs an improved self-description rather than a set of foundations. The idea that it ought to have foundations was a result of Enlightenment Scientism, which was in turn a survival of the religious need to have human projects underwritten by non-human authority. Where have we mentioned this before?
To have them underwritten by non-human authority?
Scientism.
Oh, yeah, of course. Richard Rorty has talked about this a lot before, and we've talked about this in other podcasts before, too.
That's right. And now he's writing this in the 80s. Okay. So scientism, which wasn't a new topic at the time at all, that is what you do not want to fall into if you're talking scientifically, because scientism is itself a manifestation of this religious need to have, rather than theology, religion, whatever it might be, as the source of authority, science then becomes the authority.
Yeah.
You have your own worship and rituals that are involved in science, because science will explain everything.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, reminds me of our scientism critiques of militant atheists that we've gone over many times, too.
Yes. Speaking of which, I sent you that lecture by James Lindsay, which is pretty good.
Oh, yeah, I'll check that out for sure.
Okay. All right, next page 53. Rorty continues, saying, we need a redescription of liberalism as the hope that culture as a whole can be poeticized, rather than as the Enlightenment hope that it can be rationalized or scientized. That is, we need to substitute the hope that chances for fulfillment of idiosyncratic fantasies will be equalized for the hope that everyone will replace passion or fantasy with reason. In my view, an ideally liberal polity would be one whose cultural hero is Bloom's strong poet, rather than the warrior, the priest, the sage, or the truth-seeking, logical, objective scientist. Such a culture would slough off the Enlightenment vocabulary, which enshrines the presuppositions of Sandel's questions to Isaiah Berlin. It would no longer be haunted by specters called relativism and irrationalism. Such a culture would not assume that a form of cultural life is stronger than its philosophical foundations. Instead, it would drop the idea of such foundations. It would regard the justification of liberal society simply as a matter of historical comparison with other attempts at social organization. Those of the past and those envisaged by utopians. Okay, so 2 points he's making here is that to answer the charges of relativism and irrationalism, you just drop these kind of philosophical standards altogether. It's not necessary to appeal to those.
Right.
And liberal democracy, again, going back to the title, of the contingency of it, is just something that emerged given a certain set of contingent historical circumstances in the past. And also a redescription that was taking place over the ensuing centuries of what it looked like. Even coming up to the day, we're still talking about what does democracy mean. We're still talking about how democracy is better or worse. We're still talking about how it's important to have democracy. Okay, well, democracy's changed. Democracy will continue to change as long as it remains a way of social organization which itself is contingent. And who knows what it's going to look like 100 years from now. Might fall back into tyranny, might be theocratic for a time. Then democracy reemerges of a different sort. Okay? It's just one way of social organization that, by many standards, works the best, seems to work the best versus others. Now, you could even go back all the way to you could even go back all the way to Aristotle, who was no fan of democracy, but it was better than mobocracy or something like that.
Yeah.
Or even tyranny. You know, democracy is better than tyranny, but democracy is no bed of roses either.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so let's go to the next page, page 54. He continues. To sum up, the moral I want to draw from my discussion of the claim that Isaiah Berlin's position is relativistic is that this charge should not be answered, but rather evaded. We should learn to brush aside questions like, how do you know that freedom is the chief goal of social organization? In the same way as we brush aside questions like, how do you know that Jones is worthy of your friendship? Or how do you know that Yeats is an important poet, Hegel an important philosopher, and Galileo an important scientist? We should see allegiance to social institutions as no more matters for justification by reference to familiar, commonly accepted premises, but also as no more arbitrary than choices of friends or heroes. Such choices are not made by reference to criteria. They cannot be preceded by presuppositionalist critical reflection, conducted in no particular language and outside of any particular historical context. So that's a good way to avoid questions. Well, how do you know? Fill in the blank. Just evade it.
Right. That's what Rorty likes to do.
That's a Rortian gambit right there.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. What else did I have here? Okay, skipping over a lot. Talks about Michael Oakeshott, which we're not going to get into. This is a long essay, so okay. Page 61. Getting towards the end here. Rorty says, to sum up, the citizens of my liberal utopia would be people who had a sense of the contingency of their language of moral deliberation, and thus of their consciences, and thus of their community. They would be liberal ironists, people who met Schumpeter's criterion of civilization, people who combine commitment with a sense of the contingency of their own commitment. That's where the irony comes in. Because you commit to society, to civilization, with the understanding that it's contingent. Not that it was predestined or something like that.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's see. Skipping over more here. This is a long essay. Okay. Page 68. This is the last paragraph. Rorty says, I should like to replace both religious and philosophical accounts of a supra-historical ground or an end-of-history convergence with a historical narrative about the rise of liberal institutions and customs. The institutions and customs which were designed to diminish cruelty, make possible government by the consent of the governed, and permit as much domination-free communication as possible to take place. Such a narrative would clarify the conditions in which the idea of truth as correspondence to reality might gradually be replaced by the idea of truth as what comes to be believed in the course of free and open encounters. Let me read this again. The idea of truth as correspondence to reality might gradually be replaced by the idea of truth as what comes to be believed in the course of free and open encounters. That shift from epistemology to politics, from an explanation of the relation between, quote, reason and reality to an explanation of how political freedom has changed our sense of what human inquiry is good for is a shift which John Dewey was willing to make, but from which Habermas hangs back. Habermas, Jürgen Habermas, still wants to insist that, quote, the transcendent moment of universal validity bursts every provinciality asunder. The validity laid claim to is distinguished from the social currency of a de facto established practice, and yet it serves as the foundation of an existing consensus. And by the way, Habermas, who has been around for a long time, starting to gain ascendancy in the 70s and the 80s, but he was committed to a sort of Kantian Enlightenment, supra-historical about universal validity and rational categories. So Rorty is critical of Habermas's take on this. But he continues, it is precisely this claim of universal validity which what I have called the, quote, contingency of language makes implausible, and which the poeticized culture of my liberal utopia would no longer make. Such a culture would instead agree with Dewey that, quote, imagination is the chief instrument of the good. Art is more moral than moralities, for the latter either are, or tend to become, consecrations of the status quo. The moral prophets of humanity have always been poets, even though they spoke in free verse or by parable. Okay, so also what one can intimate from that is, particularly where morality is concerned, you can learn a lot more by reading poetry and novels and literature than you can by reading dry, dusty philosophical texts that talk all about universal validity, programs, standards, strictures, and so on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I like that point.
All right. The end. And we are finished with the section of contingency.
Awesome.
All right. So that's as far as I want to go. I want to save the next essay, Private Irony and Liberal Hope, for next time. But does all this make sense so far? So the theme of contingency running through language, selfhood, and liberal community, I think, is manifest now. So let's recap. Language itself is contingent. Speaking of truth or falsity, you do away with that in Rorty's view. True, and he defines this later on, is whatever comes from free and open conversations, rather than appealing to something that is transcendent, superhistorical, outside of communication, language, and out there, quote, out there in the world. So this is the criticism of a correspondence theory of truth. Okay, that's figuring in language. About selfhood, it is one realizes the contingency of one's language. One is creating oneself in a sort of Nietzschean approach, instead of digging deep down and finding what is the essence of oneself or coming to a discovery of what was already there from the beginning. And the difficulty lies in how one can, well, first of all, the strong poet / genius is the one who breaks free of a lot of that, escapes from the history that came before him or her to create something new, looking back at the past and saying, thus I willed it, instead of, I am just one product of, inescapably, of what came before me. And then for us lesser beings, we are tasked with the often difficult task of creating oneself through our lives. Okay.
Right.
Understanding that this creation will change because of the contingency itself of self. Okay. And then with the liberal community, it is taking language and taking the selfhood, and then going back to what he had mentioned in the introduction about liberal ironists. These are the ones who are committed to liberal, the classical liberal view of, instead of appealing to something that is divine, outside, out in the world, above everything, that it is within the community, finite mortal human beings conversing with other finite mortal human beings, and the limitations included with each of them, to continue free and open conversations, committed to the ideal of a liberal community, not making anything taboo, committed to that idea of a liberal community, while at the same time understanding that liberal community and liberalism itself is contingent.
Right.
It did not come from some sort of progress that happened in the past. Although one, could credibly say that there was some sort of progress that was happening, but it's not a linear type of progress. Because of what happened in the past, you go all the way back to the Greeks. How it happened with the Greeks and then through the Romans coming into Europe, the birth of the Enlightenment, liberal democracy, and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so one can only track going back and say, yeah, when this happened, this happened, this happened, and this happened, a kind of progress, but it was not linear, kind of contingent, piecemeal, haphazard, take 2 steps back, take 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Here it is, committed to that with the understanding that it is contingent and that in the future it probably will look something different than what it is now.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
So that is the contingency of language, of selfhood, and of liberal community, the first part of the book. Questions, comments?
No, I like that. I like all those points he made. It's especially the first part about going into Nietzsche and Freud,
right,
and the other parts as well.
Yep.
Yeah,
okay.
No, it's very interesting.
All right, so that's all I got.
All right. Well, thanks again for that. Always interesting and educational. And thanks to everyone for watching. Hope you enjoyed that just as much as we did. And thanks to everyone who presses the like button on this video. Those of you who subscribe to my channel. I just saw earlier that I got a few more subscribers. Yay. It keeps going up by a couple every once in a while, which is slow but still progress. And yes, thanks to everyone who shares the video also, and especially to those of you who give me money on Patreon, which even though it's a small amount so far, I very much appreciate. And yeah, like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all, and groove is in the heart.
Groove is in the heart.
All right. Anything else to say before we ended there, Tim?
Thus we willed it.
Thus we willed it. All right. Adios until next time, everyone.